If you were launching the most influential movement in history, who would you pick for your team? Geniuses? Warriors? Kings? You'd want the best and the brightest, right? Well, the founder of Christianity did the exact opposite. He didn't recruit from the Ivy League of Jerusalem's religious schools. He didn't look for the rich, the connected, or the powerful. Instead, he walked along the shore of a lake and into a dirty tax collector's booth and put together a team that nobody in their right mind would have chosen to change the world. And that was the whole point. It has to be one of the most counterintuitive strategies in history. The man his followers would call the Son of God, with a mission to turn the world upside down and save humanity, built his entire movement on a foundation of, well, ordinary people. Fishermen, a tax collector, a political extremist, these were the guys he chose. They were uneducated, a little rough around the edges, and in some cases, completely despised by the very people they were supposed to transform. So why would a figure with such a massive job deliberately pick the unqualified? Why build a spiritual revolution on such an unlikely and frankly unstable foundation? This wasn't an accident or a sign of desperation. It was a deliberate, calculated, and totally radical statement. The choice of these ordinary men was one of Jesus' most profound sermons, all by itself. To get why he chose them is to get the very heart of his message, a message that would echo through eternity, not because of how strong the messengers were, but because of how weak they were. To get just how wild this was, you have to picture their world. First century Judea was a pressure cooker. On one hand, you had the crushing military and political power of the Roman Empire, a superpower that stamped out any rebellion. On the other, you had the religious elite, the Pharisees and Sadducees, who held all the social and spiritual cards. They were the scholars, the experts on God's law, the gatekeepers of faith. In that world, power was a one-way street. It flowed from the top down. To get anything done, you needed a powerful sponsor, a brilliant scholar, or a famous general. The savior everyone was waiting for was supposed to be a warrior king who would kick Rome out and make Israel great again. And into this world walks Jesus of Nazareth. He has a revolutionary message, a whole new vision for humanity. And who does he pick for his inner circle? His future leaders? Not the people with impressive resumes. He chooses the nobodies. And this decision, this crazy bet on the ordinary, would become the secret ingredient to a revolution that would outlast the Roman Empire itself. The Gospel of Luke tells us that right before making this huge choice, Jesus went up on a mountain and spent the entire night in prayer. This wasn't a snap decision. It was a foundational moment, soaked in purpose. When the sun came up, he called his followers and chose 12 of them. And not a single one came from the religious establishment. So, let's meet the team. The first and most famous was Simon, a fisherman Jesus would rename Peter. Peter wasn't a theologian. He was a working man with calloused hands and a temper that could flare up in an instant. He was impulsive and often said the first thing that came into his head. A man of incredible passion, but also incredible doubt and failure. With him were his brother Andrew and their business partners, James and John, all fishermen. These four were the core of his new movement. They were blue-collar guys who knew the smell of fish and the ache of manual labor, not the fine points of religious law. Their expertise was in nets, not scripture. Then you have Matthew. If the fishermen were just common, Matthew was an outcast. He was a tax collector, which, in their world, was one of the most hated jobs you could have. Tax collectors were seen as traitors, working for the Roman enemy to squeeze money out of their own people. They were usually corrupt and considered ceremonially unclean by the religious folks. For Jesus to even talk to a tax collector was shocking. To invite one into his inner circle? That was a full-blown scandal. And in this same group, Jesus put Simon the Zealot. The Zealots were radical nationalists who wanted to overthrow Rome with violence. They were the sworn enemies of everything Matthew the tax collector stood for. One guy worked for Rome, the other wanted to burn Rome to the ground. In any other setting, these two would have been at each other's throats. But in Jesus' circle, they were supposed to be brothers. The rest of the list is just as unremarkable. Philip, Bartholomew, Thomas, who we call Doubting Thomas for his skepticism, and a few others. These were not the guys you'd pick to start a global movement. Years later, the religious leaders in Jerusalem looked at Peter and John, stunned by their boldness, and noted that they were just unschooled, ordinary men. Their only credential was that they had been with Jesus. This was the team. A motley crew of fishermen, a social reject, a political radical, and a bunch of other regular guys. They were flawed, they argued with each other, and they were often slow to understand what their leader was trying to teach them. So, why them? The answer shows up in a series of strategic moves that reveal the upside-down nature of Jesus' kingdom. So, what was the first reason for this strange hiring strategy? It was the message itself. The choice was the servant. By blowing past the elite and picking men from the margins of society, Jesus was making a powerful living statement. This is for everyone. His kingdom wasn't some exclusive club for the holy, the rich, or the smart. It was a grassroots movement, built from the ground up, open to anyone, no matter who you were or what you'd done. The fishermen represented the working class, the backbone of society that the powerful usually ignored. Matthew the tax collector represented the outcast, the sinner, the person everyone else had given up on. Simon the Zealot represented the passionate, the person desperate for justice. By bringing such a diverse and conflicting group together, Jesus was showing that his movement could create a totally new kind of community where a tax collector and a zealot could be family. This was a preview of the church he was building, a place where the walls that divide people, social, political, religious, would come crashing down. And this radical inclusivity wasn't just about the 12. Throughout his ministry, Jesus consistently lifted up the people on the lowest rungs of society's ladder. He brought women into his circle as key partners and supporters, which was totally countercultural in that patriarchal world. Women like Mary Magdalene and Joanna helped fund his ministry, and it was women who were the first ones to witness his resurrection, the single most important event in Christianity. He reached out to Samaritans, a group that Jews hated. He touched lepers, who were considered untouchable. He ate dinner with sinners, which drew constant criticism from the religious elite, who thought holiness meant keeping your distance from people like that. Even his own birth story is about God choosing the ordinary. The mother of the Messiah wasn't a queen or a priest's wife. It was Mary, a young, poor, unknown girl from a backwater town. The first people to hear the news of his birth weren't nobles in a palace, but shepherds in a field, a dirty, lowly job. You see the pattern? From beginning to end, the story is the same. God's favor isn't saved for the powerful. It's poured out on the humble, the overlooked, and the ordinary. Choosing ordinary disciples was the perfect way to live out that core message. It proved that in God's kingdom, your past doesn't disqualify you, and your lack of credentials is no problem at all. The second reason is maybe the most important one. Choosing ordinary people made one thing crystal clear. The power behind this movement was not human. It was divine. Think about it. What if Jesus had chosen a different path? Suppose he'd recruited the most brilliant scholars, the richest merchants, and the most connected political leaders. If the movement had exploded across the world, who would have gotten the credit? Everyone would have said, well, of course it succeeded. Look at those brilliant strategists and wealthy backers. The success would have been chalked up to human talent. But by choosing a bunch of fishermen, Jesus guaranteed that if the movement worked, the only possible explanation would be the power of God. Their weakness was the perfect black velvet background to make a diamond of divine power shine. Their ordinariness was the point. Their transformation was the proof. The Apostle Paul, a key leader in the early church, nailed this idea in a letter he wrote. God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, so that no one might boast in the presence of God. This is a complete reversal of how the world works. The world celebrates strength and status. But God, Paul says, intentionally chooses the opposite to prove where the real power comes from. The success of the disciples wasn't going to hinge on how smart or charismatic they were. It was going to depend completely on their connection to him. And that's exactly what happened. After Jesus' death and resurrection, these same guys who had been timid, doubtful, and often clueless were transformed into bold, unstoppable leaders. The book of Acts tells us that Peter, the fisherman who had denied he even knew Jesus 3 times out of fear, stood up in the middle of Jerusalem and spoke with so much power that 3,000 people joined the movement in one day. Later, when Peter and John were arrested and dragged before the Sanhedrin, the same powerful council that had condemned Jesus, the leaders were floored. The text says, when they saw the boldness of Peter and John and perceived that they were uneducated, common men, they were astonished. And they recognized that they had been with Jesus. That was the only explanation that made sense. Their courage didn't come from a fancy school. It came from their time with Jesus. Their transformation became the ultimate proof of his message. The evidence wasn't in some complicated argument, but in the changed lives of these very ordinary men. Okay, beyond the big theological statements, there was also a really practical reason for picking these guys. They were teachable. The religious experts and the powerful people were already deeply invested in the system. Their identity and reputation were all tied up in the status quo. They had rigid beliefs, positions to protect, and a reputation for being wise that made it hard for them to be humble and learn something new. To follow a radical carpenter from Nazareth, they would have had to unlearn a lifetime of teaching and give up the very status that made them important. They just had too much to lose. The fishermen and tax collectors, they had very little to lose and everything to gain. They weren't trapped by the same traditions or blinded by the same pride. They were, in many ways, a blank slate. Their minds were open to new, radical ideas because they weren't already cluttered with established doctrines. They didn't have to protect a reputation. And you see it in their response. When Jesus said, "Follow me," the fishermen immediately left their nets and followed him. When he called Matthew, the tax collector, left everything, rose, and followed him. This wasn't because they were gullible. It's because they saw something real in Jesus that the experts completely missed. They were looking for hope, not trying to defend a position. This made them incredibly moldable in the hands of their teacher. They could be shaped and trained without all the resistance that would have come from people who thought they already had all the answers. And because of this, their loyalty was deeper. Their new identity wasn't just another line on an already impressive resume. It completely replaced their old life. Jesus gave them a new purpose, a new community, a new hope. Their devotion wasn't divided. He was it. This single-minded loyalty born from knowing they were ordinary and had been shown extraordinary grace became the engine that drove them to the ends of the earth to share his message, even when it meant persecution and death. Their loyalty wasn't to an idea, but to a person who saw value in them when no one else did. The strategy Jesus used 2,000 years ago still speaks loud and clear today. It challenges our modern obsession with resonance, influence, and status. If you find this story as fascinating as I do, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you do and miss our next deep dive into the powerful stories of history and faith. And I'd love to hear from you in the comments. What does Jesus' choice of ordinary people mean to you? So when you boil it all down, why these ordinary guys? He chose them because they were ordinary. His choice was a brilliant strategy and a deep spiritual statement all rolled into one. He chose them to prove that his message was for everyone, smashing the walls of elitism and creating a movement where outcasts and working stiffs stood shoulder to shoulder. He chose them to show that the power of his kingdom didn't come from human smarts, but from divine grace, making sure that God alone would get the credit. And he chose them because they were humble and open, which made them teachable and fiercely loyal, the perfect people to be shaped into world changers. The story of the disciples isn't just about a dozen guys from ancient Galilee. It's a message for all of us. It's an encouragement that the things we see as our weaknesses, our lack of status, our messy pasts, our feeling of being completely and utterly ordinary, are not liabilities in the hands of a God who specializes in using the unlikely. The revolution that started with a handful of fishermen didn't succeed because they were extraordinary. It succeeded because they followed an extraordinary leader who convinced them that even a nobody could be part of something that would change the world forever. And that is a message that is just as radical and just as full of hope today as it was 2,000 years ago.